Hey, this is Toby. In this video I'm going to make a couple of hangboards, but not everything will work out as planned. For all the non-climbers out there, a hangboard is a piece of training equipment for finger strength training, and as the name suggests, you just hang from it. This portable hangboard here is how my path of making training equipment and shaping climbing holds started. I made it back in 2018. Soon I realized that I needed something smaller to actually make it portable. This is how I came up with this pair of hangboards, which I've been using in all sorts of places over the years. For this video, I wanted to combine several ideas to create a non-portable hangboard. Number one, I wanted to continue to use multiple smaller and thinner pieces of wood instead of using one big slab of wood and potentially wasting a lot of material. Number two, I wanted to try out a certain layout similar to that of the original lattice testing and training rung. I've been using this hangboard in the past for a couple of years. I like the basic nature of it with only one warm-up chuck and one 20mm edge with a nice 10mm edge radius. But I always felt like the chuck could be a little bit more sloped, and I also didn't really like the boxy shape of some of the edges, especially noticeable when using the chuck to warm up or to do pull-ups. This is why I ended up liking this design, which I'm going to call the Wave. Lastly, I didn't want to use any screws this time while making the hangboards. Instead, I wanted to use more traditional joinery and learn how to use my new router table setup. In my mind, combining different wood species in a pleasant way should also help with the aesthetics of the final hangboard, which is important to me. I tend to use things more often if there are reasons why I should gravitate towards them, and looking nice is one of the reasons. Let's start with sourcing the material. I recorded this project in my dad's workshop. This video was recorded just after we moved back from New Zealand to Germany, and I didn't have my own workshop yet. I'm very grateful that he not only allowed me to use some of his tools, but also that he made space for some of my tools, and allowed me to use some of his wood. This wood has been cut down by my dad more than 30 years ago, and has been sitting and drying in my parents' garage since then. I really enjoyed being back in this workshop, where I learned so much as a teenager and young adult. This is where I worked on my first woodworking projects, such as a poker table, an electric guitar and an electric bass guitar. As I don't intend to make just one hangboard, I've prepared several boards. The types of wood are as follows, starting from the right: cherry, ash, black locust, elm, maple and poplar. The smaller boards are supposed to be European walnut and spalted maple. I'm not so sure about the walnut, it looks more like apple wood to me. At this point I had already prepared a set of boards with the router table and hadn't recorded the process, as I wasn't sure if it was a good idea at first. After all, I was happy with the result of the milling, so I started recording again when I glued the boards together. Up to this point everything had worked out as planned. In hindsight, I'm pretty sure it was so easy to glue these boards together because Robinia wood, also known as black locust, is quite weather resistant and doesn't swell as much when it gets wet. Let's talk about the equipment you will see next. This time I decided to go with the buy once and have no regrets approach. I've taken the buy cheap, buy twice approach several times in the past, and I've seen in my dad's workshop that many of the larger tools can last a lifetime. For this reason I opted for a Jessam router table in combination with a Festool router. The so-called clear-cut stock guides, which you can see here, are also from Jessam and help to make things safer, smoother and more precise. Just to be clear, I'm not being sponsored, I'm just happy to be lucky enough to own a couple of good tools. Yes, I should have cleaned up the burn marks from sawing beforehand, but sometimes you can fix it in post and no one will ever know, except if it's on video. This looks much better now. Wiping with a damp cloth ensures that the boards are clean and dust free. In this case, however, the cloth was perhaps a little too wet. Either way, either because the boards were a little too wet or because of the different wood, it's cherry and maple, or simply because of the tighter fit, I really struggled to slide the railing to the bottom board. So at some point I could only continue with the help of a large clamp. That wasn't really what I had planned, and I was still looking for a quicker solution. But unfortunately, the other options were not promising, and I was running out of time, as the glue was getting drier by the second. After a few more desperate hammer blows, I realized that I had to make an effort or I would fail. At least I managed to get the job done. I'm not sure whether the clamps in this case are actually necessary. I used them because of the small gap, which I hoped would disappear. After I had attached a small rung to the board, I continued with the chuck. The chuck still needs some preparation before I can glue it to the main board. In particular, the lower part of the front of the chuck needs to be finished before I can put everything together. This is where a large belt sander comes in handy. For me, sanding is one of the few things in the workshop that is both a chore and a pleasure. The work itself is quite boring and repetitive, but also meditative, and the process itself makes things look much nicer. This time I wanted to make sure that the gluing didn't turn into a training session for my forearms. That's why I reworked all the edges and corners and checked the fit again before applying the glue. Looks like a pretty good fit to me. Hopefully it will be the same once the glue is applied. For most of my projects I go through the steps in my head in advance and try to figure out what challenges I'm going to face. Sometimes this works quite well. Sometimes I overthink stuff, and sometimes I completely overlook something, which was the case here. Fortunately, I'm not talking about sliding the two boards into each other. I'm talking about how I want to apply even pressure with the clamps in the next step. Because of the curved top surface of the chuck, the clamp acts like a lever, with the edge of the main board acting as a hinge, which is not ideal and something I'm noticing here. I decided to use clamps from both sides to hopefully counteract the torque, but as you'll see in a second, it doesn't look like it worked. Fortunately, I'm not too worried because the forces involved in using the chuck should work in my favor, as they should be directed outwards at the top and inwards at the bottom. I also assume that the wooden joint alone should be strong enough to handle the forces involved when hanging from the chuck. Plus, I already have an idea in my head how I can avoid this with the next hangboard. It already looks pretty much as I imagined it. There's just one small thing I want to change. I want to create a slightly convex section at the bottom of the chuck, so that it looks more like a wave that breaks. Let's make a few more passes with this router bit. I bet some of you know router bits that are much better suited for this task, but this is the one I had lying around that seemed the most useful to me. I just wanted to see if I could make the hangboard as I had envisioned it. At this point it wasn't about efficiency. Sometimes it's just fun to try something different. I also chose quite soft wood, in this case cherry and maple. Still, I was quite surprised how easy it was to sand this convex feature by hand. All I needed was some good old heavy-duty P60 sandpaper. Spoiler alert, I only created this convex feature on this hangboard. Based on how this chuck feels to me, I opted for the slightly harder and easier to make non-convex chuck on the other hangboards, which you will see later. Let's see if we can improve this first concept of a hangboard. Here are a bunch of boards for a few more hangboards. You've already seen at the beginning of the video how I ran these boards through the thicknesser. Just to be clear, sanding the boards is not always necessary. If you have a really good thicknesser with really sharp blades and the grain of the boards is in your favor, you can probably skip this step. In practice, though, there's often a tiny bit of tear out and maybe even snipe. For the quality control, I use the cast iron tabletop of my belt sander to see if the boards get sucked to the table when I try to quickly lift them right at their center of gravity. Let's quickly cut the boards to the exact same dimensions, so I don't mess anything up later. I use a tine cutter for milling the wooden joints. The tine cutter has a shank diameter of 12 mm and a diameter of 19 mm at the tip, with a cutting angle of 14 degrees. I know that the lack of dust extraction is not particularly good for this type of work. Ideally, I would swap the insert ring around the router bit with one with a larger opening and then have the dust extractor installed under the table. But unless I'm doing the same thing hundreds of times, I see no reason to go through the trouble of making additional modifications or even spending more money. I just wanted to see how far I could get with the current equipment. Speaking of equipment, one rule I always try to follow is, Only buy equipment if you know what you're going to use it for. If I don't have a specific use case, then I don't buy it. If I've bought a new tool and I've already used it on a few projects and I enjoy using it, I try to think of a project where the tool will be used, ideally in a way that I wouldn't have been able to realize the project otherwise. That way I learn more about what my tools are capable of, I can try something that I've never done before, and I'm always learning new things. You've probably already guessed it. This project is one of those projects that utilizes a new tool. Up until this point I had already used the router table for a few other projects, and I always had the idea in the back of my mind to come up with a slightly different design for a hangboard. Once the idea for this hangboard was born, I only needed to buy one small thing, which was the tine router bit, and I could start a new project. Another rule I always try to follow: if I don't use a tool often or no longer need it, I will sell it. Let me know if you also have some rules for buying and selling equipment. I have to admit that I really enjoyed making these wooden joints, even though it was a lot of work. It's quite satisfying when two boards finally slide into each other and it's a good fit. Please let me know if I'm doing anything wrong here, if there's anything I should have done differently, or if you know any tips in general. This kind of wood joinery is quite new to me, so please keep in mind that I'm still learning. Let's talk briefly about the specs of the rung. I mentioned at the beginning that I really like the original lattice testing and training rung, especially the finger-friendly 10mm edge radius. But I also really like the 50mm deep bottom corner pockets of the Beastmaker 2000. Furthermore, I didn't want to recreate an existing board. That's why I opted for a 15mm rung with a 10mm edge radius. I personally really like it, but I've gotten feedback from other climbers that it's quite hard and not really suitable for average climbers. It seems like I'm an average climber with weird short fingers. It took me a while to get used to it, but now I really enjoy using the rung regularly. Now we are at the point where multiple small mistakes add up. This time I'm gluing softwood to softwood. Mistake number 1 was probably that the cloth used to clean the wood was too wet. Mistake number 2, preparing two boards at the same time. Mistake number 3, I recorded this in winter, and that day, judging by the t-shirt, I apparently used the log burner a little too much, and the glue dried much faster.
Don't stop.
Okay, back to the desperate cheat with the clamps. You can clearly see that I'm a bit stressed by now. Otherwise I think I would have placed the workpiece much closer to the bar of the clamp.
No! Pull out these. Oh, come on.
It's also super funny to watch that at first I don't even realize that I can remove one more plastic piece from the clamp.
Extension.
This just shows that you should never be stressed when using dangerous tools in a workshop. You're not really focused anymore in that state.
I think this one is the last.
Please let me know if you find it any useful or entertaining when I show the fails in my videos. Let's finish it with brute force. Okay, at least I managed to finish one of them, and I don't expect this bond to fail, no matter what. I really like the grain of these boards, so I didn't want to make the same mistake here. This time it went much more smoothly, so let's quickly go through the remaining preparations to finish these beauties. Let's prepare one more thing that should help with gluing the jug to the board. Yeah, that should work. Looks good to me. So let's wrap things up. There's one thing I would like to talk about now, and that's the question whether this hangboard design was a bad idea. Depending on the point of view, I can argue for both sides. When I just see it as a one-time project, I think it was a good idea. I learned a lot along the way. I'm also a little bit proud that I managed to realize my idea and created something unique, and I personally really like the actual hangboard. But as some of you probably know, I have sold a lot of climbing holes over the years. So when I made these hangboards, I also thought that maybe at some point people can buy these on my website. I personally think that when you see this hangboard as a product, it is a bad idea. Making these hangboards was way too complicated and thus too time consuming to actually turn these into a commercially viable product. Unfortunately, I also didn't have the opportunity to make more of them. In the last 2 years since filming, I moved in and out of multiple workshops in Munich, and I didn't have all the tools easily available since then. That's why they never made it on my website, even as a luxury item. That having said, I would love to get your feedback. Do you think this was a bad idea? What would you change in terms of specifications and design? Maybe I even inspire someone to come up with their own hangboard design. So please let me know if I do so. You can also contact me on Instagram at Tobias Wurft. And for those of you who thought, didn't he prepare much more wood? Yes, there's still a lot left. But the most important question now, can I hang from it? I hope you enjoyed this video. See you in the next one.